Well, welcome to Caliphs of the Muslims, their wives and concubines. Now, first thing I have to tell you is this is a persona class. What does that mean? Well, it's going to be told to you by someone from their perspective of their persona. And that's really important, particularly as we discuss reality. If you're watching the picture on your screen, it might appear to be medieval at first glance, of course, except for the woman over on the right holding her cell phone. So, things are going to be a little different. It's not well, first thing we need to cover is this is not a university course from the perspective of being academic. All right, so what you're going to get here isn't academic study or academic information. It's social information, which is a little bit different. What do I mean by that? Well, let's talk about that a little bit as we explain what's going on. And I have to issue some warnings here. First of all, I should introduce myself as a storyteller. That's what I do. I tell stories. And as with all stories, that's what they are. They're stories. Stories, however, can be enlightening. When you hear or read a story from hundreds of years ago, it can give you an impression of how people thought during that period, what their attitudes were, what their biases were. And certainly that's the way things are going to go here. What you're going to hear isn't footnoted history. And I'm not going to give you footnotes or give you book names or say, here's where this particular item came from. Most storytellers don't do that. They just tell you the story. Okay? And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be telling you some stories. Are they all true? Of course not. I'm going to, in fact, point out to you the story of Washington and the cherry tree. You've ever heard the story of Washington and the cherry tree? Washington chopped down a cherry tree and then went and told his father, I cannot tell a lie, it was I. That's not a true story, folks. That was a story created by Washington's cronies when he was trying to be elected president as a way of explaining to everyone how honest George Washington was. George Washington was a pretty honest guy. I mean, relatively. He did keep fake journals for us when he was fighting the revolution and made up entries for those and did a certain amount of lying on his own. There's a whole book written about it called George Washington's Expense Account. If you ever want to read something funny, you could read George Washington's expense account and realize that, well, George wasn't the totally honest guy that the cherry tree story would like us to think he was. So stories, of course, are they true? Of course they're not true. Do they tell you something about the period? Sure they do. They told us that amongst all of the people that were our early founding fathers, George Washington was a pretty respectable guy. And I would certainly agree with that. That's certainly the story that was going around, that George was an honest guy, an honest broker. So if nothing else, at least tells you that his political cronies were trying to paint him that way. And that's a fact in itself, that his political cronies were trying to paint him in that particular light. During this class, you will hear the story, what I like to call the story of the one vote. Did it actually happen that way? We'll never know. There's not enough data. This is one version to which I picked up of people telling it in the part of the world that my persona comes from. Is it true? We never know. In fact, some of these caliphs we're going to talk about, we don't know whether they became caliph when they were 17 or when they were 23. So there's a fair amount of no one really knows about some of this stuff. Is the story of the one vote true? Probably not. But it's used as a way to explain to people why things are the way they are. Does that make them wrong? I don't think that really makes them wrong. It just makes them a case of, okay, here's things that are the way some people thought they were. It's not really that they're false. It's just one version of events. Since no one knows what really happens or really happened, this is sort of one version of event of that kind of thing. So you're going to hear that story, and it is, in fact, as I point out, a story, not history from the point of view of, well, I can give you the footnotes for this, and here's the book that it came. There's always somebody, by the way, after this, I tell a story that somebody comes back and says, well, I've heard it differently. Of course you've heard it differently. There are lots of different ways to tell this story. So you're going to hear it differently from different people. This is, in fact, one version of that. I want to apologize in advance, too, before we get into the persona part of this. I don't really have the best radio voice that you could possibly have. My radio voice sounds a little bit too much like Kermit the Frog. So I apologize, and I know the organizer's saying that they're not going to judge us on our video quality. I know you guys are judging me up one side, down the other, but that's okay. Again, I apologize for the quality of the voice. I just don't have the kind of voice that you really want to have when you're doing radio. But I think you'll be able to tell when my persona comes on. My persona is named Chengir, and Chengir is from Khorasan. That's really the far east, if you will, of the Islamic Empire from around 1220 AD. So as part of a persona story, you're going to hear him talk about things. And by the way, because he's from the East, he tends to be an Abbasid supporter. I think you'll be able to tell that as he talks about various people. And people in the East really had a pretty good opinion of the early Caliphs. And of course, the Abbasids, that was the side they were on. Just like there's more than one political party in the United States, there's certainly more than one storytelling side in the Islamic history world. He's not that big a fan of the Umayyads being Westerners, the other political party, if you will. Like many people today, they tend to tell scurrilous stories about the people in the other party. So you'll hear Chengir do this. He will use his biases from the East to talk about the various characters that you're going to hear during the story. And this really is an experiment. It started out many, many years ago when the East Kingdom started a bardic college. And it started out as a story case of, so how would my persona have told someone else from their time or from any other time about the Caliphs that he'd heard about? And of course, he's going to tell you the stories he's heard about them. He's going to tell you some rather famous stories about them. But also bear in mind that you're not going to hear all the Caliphs here. In fact, I'm going to stop at 1220 because my persona wouldn't have known any Caliphs after that. So although there are many Caliphs after the end of this tale, doesn't mean that I'm going to tell you about them, because as far as my character is concerned, they don't exist. They haven't been born yet, or at least haven't become Caliph. So without further ado, and as a story, this is how I've always believed my persona would have told you about all the Caliphs of Islam. And I'm going to start off by giving you some notes. These are the only things that are really true about the stories you're going to hear. So the names and the order are correct. This is the last history part. And whenever you see one of these slides, you can see, okay, this is history. This is the names of the people. This is when they were Caliph, as far as we know. This is the house they belonged to, who their parents were, that kind of thing. The Arabic name, the Arabic writing for their name, that kind of thing. But when you're not seeing this slide, that's when we're going to be telling a story. And without further ado, this is Chengir's list of who the Caliphs of Islam were. Now, as everyone knows, the very first Caliph was named Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was very famous as a rug merchant. He was one of the companions of the Prophet. And when the Prophet met the destroyers of delights and the sunderer of societies, everyone went back to what they had been doing before. Certain people went back to being talkers. Others went back to being other things. But there was no one who had been assigned by the Prophet to take his place. There was no one who anyone had determined would be successor. Well, that caused a great deal of consternation. And what they did was they all met Abu Bakr in the marketplace. And there was Abu Bakr selling rugs. They said, Abu Bakr, what are you doing? He says, I'm living my life. I'm here as I was before. I'm but a tradesman. And they all turned to him and said, no. You cannot be just a simple tradesman. You have to be the successor of the Prophet. And Abu Bakr disagreed and he did not want to, thought he was not worthy enough to be the successor of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Well, they all went back to Abu Bakr's house and they argued some more. And Abu Bakr told them, he said, look, I cannot be the successor of the Caliph. How am I to feed my family? And they argued and they remonstrated. And after a while, all of the companions of the Prophet gathered together and they voted. And they voted that they would give Abu Bakr a pension, not a great pension of a prince, nor a tiny, tiny pension, but a pension of the middling sort, so that he might do the work of the Prophet and still feed his family. And so it was agreed, so much so that to this day, the official salary of the Prophet, its successors, is a pension of the middling sort, of course. And Abu Bakr ruled for 2 years. And he ruled wisely and he ruled well, but his reign did not last very long. And when it ended, there was the same consternation amongst the companions of the Prophet. Who would lead next? Well, they could not agree. And so they all gathered together in Abu Bakr's house again. And in Abu Bakr's house, they had a vote. There were many candidates, those who thought they could succeed Abu Bakr. There was Uthman. There was Ali. There were a few others as well. And no one could decide who should actually have the right to succeed Abu Bakr. So they held a vote. The votes were cast, and Ali had votes on one side, and Umar had votes on the other. And the votes were counted and counted again. And at the end, Umar had one more vote than did Ali. Well, there was a great deal of gnashing of teeth of those who had voted for Ali, who thought that Ali, being a relative of the Prophet, deserved to be Caliph. For Umar was not the relative of the Prophet. No. Umar was just the father of one of Muhammad's wives. So why should he be Caliph? And it was this moment, this very moment, the casting of the one vote for Umar, where we have the founding of the Shiites. The Shiites, or the Shia Ali, the party of Ali. Those people who thought Ali should have been the Caliph and not Umar. And so we have the Shia Ali being very angry and gnashing of teeth, but they finally agreed that because there had been a vote, that Umar would become Caliph. Umar was Caliph for 10 years, much longer than Abu Bakr. In fact, there is a very famous story of Umar. Umar was a pious man and not a very princely man. So much so that a group of Romans once came to Mecca, asked to meet with the Caliph. And they came upon a man gathering his flock of goats in the middle of the town. They said, "We wish to speak with the leader of the Muslims." The man turned to them and said, "Well, very well. Go down to the end of the street. Ask anyone there where Umar's house is. And they will direct you to Umar's house. And there you'll be able to speak with the Caliph of the Muslims. He will be along shortly." And they went and did as he said. And they went down to the house, and people pointed out and said, "Oh, this is Umar's house." They went into the house, and Umar was not there, and they were allowed to wait. And after a while, the man came in, the man they had met on the road with his goats. And they said, "What is going on here? You told us this was the house of the Caliph of the Muslims." The man said, "Well, as a matter of fact, it is." "Well, where is he?" And the man who'd been herding his sheep when they came into town simply turned to him and said, "It is I. I am Umar, the Caliph of the Muslims." And that is a famous story of Umar, and told to remind you that Umar, at least of himself, thought of himself not as a prince or as a leader, but as a common man, but knew at least he was Caliph of the Muslims. Now, for the very first caliphs of the Muslims, other than Abu Bakr, they do not end very well. The retirement principle for caliphs is not very good. Umar is the first one to suffer from this because at the end of his 10-year reign, Umar is assassinated. He dies by the sword. Not a very good ending, of course. But when Umar dies, there is the same problem as always before. Who would succeed Umar? Once again, since they had no other way of deciding, all of the surviving companions of the Prophet all gathered together in Abu Bakr's house. And there was a vote. Ali again stood forward as being one of the candidates. And others stood forward as candidates. And when the voting was done, it is said that Ali had again lost the vote by but one vote. And of course, this made the Shia Ali, the party of Ali, very angry. Once again, their candidate, their chosen candidate, did not become caliph, but instead, it was one of Umar's relatives, a man by the name of Uthman. Uthman was not a very wise man, certainly not as wise as Umar had been. But he was a pious man, and eventually the party of Ali agreed that all right, there had been a vote, and certainly Uthman had had won the vote, and that they would stay quiet, and Uthman would be caliph of the Muslims. And in those days, being the caliph of the Muslims was fairly simple. As we saw, Umar spent most of his time herding sheep. But things were beginning to improve during the reign of Uthman. So much so that the stories say that one day the first secretary of the treasury came by and said, "Oh, Uthman, my caliph, my master, the treasury now has been collected, and it sits as 1 million gold dirham." And Uthman corrected him and said, No. You said that wrong. First of all, the gold coin is the dinar. You mean that we have 1 million silver dirham. We don't have that much money. We only have 1 million silver dirham. And the man said, "You're right, I misspoke myself. But the amount is 1 million gold dinar." And to this, Uthman was amazed. How could we have so much money? We never have so much money before. We've always been poor. And he did not know what to do. What does a man do when he's been poor and suddenly has 1 million gold dinar? Well, I said Uthman was not particularly wise. What he did with that 1 million gold dinar was decided that all of his family should have a pension as well. We've talked about the pension of the caliphs of the Muslims, and Uthman decided to grant the pension to all of his relatives. Not a very wise choice. And of course, this meant that he was aligning himself for the standard method for which caliphs were now removed from office. For at the end of his reign, Uthman as well was also assassinated. Once again, we arrive at our same problem. There we have everyone, the companions of the Prophet, arguing as to who should be the successors of Uthman. They argued and they demonstrated, and of course, everyone went to Abu Bakr's house. And you know the story now. Except this time, the story is a little different. Some candidates rose forward, and other candidates rose again, and Ali rose and once again asked to be made caliph. And this time Ali won, but by one vote. And finally, it was Ali who was made as the first cousin of the Prophet, caliph of the Muslims. Well, Ali, as with Uthman, wasn't always good at making decisions. He certainly wasn't as good as Umar or Abu Bakr had been. Although he was certainly a very pious man, no one would agree that he was not pious. But it wasn't long after he became Caliph, that certain people began arguing. And instead of just being arguments and the gnashing of teeth, it changed to the raising of swords. And Muslim began to fight Muslim. This angered Ali, it angered everyone, that Muslims would begin fighting amongst themselves over who should be Caliph. Surely the vote should be enough. And Ali's supporters had agreed that the Uthman and Omar should be Caliph after they lost by but one vote. Surely everyone else could agree that Ali had won by one vote, but there was anger and there was fighting. And at the end, Ali himself, because there was such anger and fighting amongst Muslims, fell before the same flaw that did not his successors and did not his predecessors meet, but that of being assassinated. This time, for the first time, by a fellow Muslim. And Ali himself fell before the sword. Well, that left certain arguments. There was, in fact, another election held, and that election was held again in Abu Bakr's house. And Ali's son, Hassan, was chosen as the next Caliph, but there were those who argued. They could not agree on how many votes were cast or who had the right to cast votes. And again, fighting broke out amongst the Muslims as to who should be Caliph, Hassan or another man who stood forward from the family of Uthman, a man by the name of Muawiyah. And Muawiyah would come forward, and Muawiyah would claim that if you only counted the votes of the companions of the Prophet and not the family of the Prophet, then he had won the vote and not Hassan. Well, this worked down to fighting and arguing back and forth between the various parties. And it was finally, even though Hassan was the son of Ali, was at first chosen as Caliph, it was Muawiyah who gained becoming Caliph by the sword. And Muawiyah eventually got everyone to agree that he would be Caliph. He is the first of the Umayyad family to become Caliph, and he ends the reign of what are sometimes called the rightly guided Caliphs. And he does this by the sword. Instead of gaining victory by votes, Muawiyah gains victory by the sword. There's an interesting story of Muawiyah that I like to tell about Kufa. By the way, if you're not from Kufa, stay away from Kufa. It's a faithless city. All sorts of terrible rebellions start in Kufa, trust me. It's not a good place to be. Muawiyah found this out. They rebelled against Muawiyah in Kufa. And did not Kufa was laid siege to by Muawiyah. And as the siege wore on, as it went on and on and on, did not Muawiyah pray to Allah? And he said, Allah, if I am Caliph, and if Kufa falls, I swear to you, I will only slaughter the Persians in Kufa and spare all the Arabs. The very next day, Kufa fell. And true to his word, the Caliph of the Muslims, Muawiyah, gathered together all the defenders of Kufa and spoke to each one individually. The first man that came before Muawiyah was an Arab. And he stood before Muawiyah, and Muawiyah said, are you an Arab or a Persian? And the man said, I am an Arab. Well, very well, I have sworn before Allah that your life is spared. Go and leave me and do not raise the rebellion again. The man went off and was allowed to live. And then the next man came forward. And Muawiyah asked him the same question. Are you an Arab or a Persian? And the man said, I'm a Persian. And Muawiyah commanded that his head be separated from his shoulders, and so it was commanded, and so it was done. And the man died on the floor right before the Caliph of the Muslims. And do you know that in a city, but the day before, was half Arab and half Persian? Muawiyah could not find any more Persians in all of the city of Kufa. They're all Arabs. Well, that's the story of Kufa. Stay away from Kufa. It's a dangerous city, certainly if you're a Persian. Now, Muawiyah had a slight change of plan. Up to now, everyone had been elected in Abu Bakr's house, except for Muawiyah, who had risen by sword. But Muawiyah decided that he would have an election too, but this time the election would be before he died. And he brought everyone not to Abu Bakr's house, but to his house. His house that he had built in Damascus, for the Caliphs no longer lived in Mecca. Now they lived in the city of Damascus. And Muawiyah brought all the companions of the Prophet in to vote and said, when I die, I wish you all to vote now to make my son Caliph of the Muslims. At first they disagreed, until they heard the sliding out of swords behind their ears. Muawiyah had stationed a guard behind each one of the companions of the Prophet. And when they refused to vote for Muawiyah's son in advance before Muawiyah's death, they drew their sabers. And again Muawiyah asked, would you please reconsider? I would like everyone to vote for my son to be my successor. And do you not know that at that very moment, for the first time ever, Muawiyah's son was unanimously proclaimed Caliph, and before Muawiyah was dead. And that, as far as we know, is the last election of a Caliph. Muawiyah eventually did pass from this world into the next, to be succeeded by his son, as was accounted by the vote, named Yazid. Now, mothers, I issue you a warning. You will see as we talk further, the one thing you do not wish to do is name your children Yazid. Yazid is not a very good name. Don't use it. For it was Yazid who was the first son of Muawiyah. And Yazid was famous for being not only poor of judgment, as others had been, but the devil incarnate himself. His opponent was Hussein, again, a member of Ali's family. And Hussein, the son of Ali, not Hassan, but Hussein, was considered to be an opponent and wished to have a vote, another vote. But Yazid would not agree to this. In fact, Yazid sent men to order Hassan to swear an oath of obedience to Yazid. He was only supposed to swear, but the forces of the Caliph trapped Hussein in a small village called Karbala. There they kept him away from water, demanding that he sign the oath. But he would not. He wished that there be another vote so that he might become Caliph instead of Yazid. Well, we all know the end of this story. Hussein was martyred, slaughtered by the forces of Yazid I. I warn you, Yazid is not a good name. And there, of course, began the whole issue of the party of Ali, the Shia Ali. And the Shia Ali became a force of their own, one which, as we all know, are sometimes bad-tempered. But for very good reason. You'd be bad-tempered too if you wound up on the wrong side of Yazid. Well, Yazid called everyone together again and insisted that they too agree. There was no vote taken, but they insisted that everyone sign a document agreeing that his son would be Caliph after he passed. They signed the document. They didn't have much choice. And when Yazid finally passed, Only 3 years later, thank Allah, he is replaced by Muawiyah II, often called the boy Caliph. He was not even an adult. That's how young Muawiyah II was. He did not last very long. Muawiyah II invented but a new way to retire as Caliph. Muawiyah II died of disease. But he was not the only Caliph. Again, the Shiites rose and they chose their own Caliph, a man called Zubair. And al-Zubair was sometimes called by Caliph. So al-Zubair was Caliph in Mecca, if you will, the party of the Shiites, the party of Ali. And it was Muawiyah II who was Caliph in Damascus. Well, things were not going well. And again, everyone got together and they made, everyone signed an agreement saying that should Muawiyah die, not his son, but his cousin would be named Caliph, another Umayyad. They would refuse to agree that al-Zubair would ever become Caliph. And because of disease, Muawiyah II did not last very long. The boy Caliph died while still being a boy. In Damascus then, did not Marwan, the cousin of Yazid, become Caliph in Damascus? Marwan, it was said to be very lacking in social graces, a great warrior, but not very polite. He'd suffered many injuries in battle fighting for Islam. And there were those who say that he was hunchbacked, and those who would say that he had many scars, which of course he probably did. But these were mostly those trying to discredit him. What everyone does agree was that Marwan hardly looked a warrior. He was tall and thin, so that they called him a gossamer like thread. That was his nickname, the gossamer like thread. He was a very, very thin man. But Marwan managed to get everyone to agree that he was in fact Caliph. And he managed to get everyone back together. And for the first time, again, Islam rose, because he was such a great fighter, they rose as one entity, as one faction, ruled from Damascus under the great Marwan of the Umayyads. And Marwan, though, being a Umayyad, made everyone swear that when he died, his son would become Caliph. And so after Marwan passes, a great many years later, we have Abdul-Malik. Abdul-Malik, his son, rose to become Caliph and was quite a strong Caliph, although a little bit larger than his father. He was Caliph for many years, and he gives us a very famous formula. There is a very famous formula of Ibn al-Malik about Romans and Franks. It is said that when meeting Abdul-Malik, did not Armenians come forward? Then he said, Abdul-Malik, we are from Armenia. Let us tell you about Armenia. They began to talk, and he stopped them. And he said, what do you mean? Look, you are not Muslims. And they said, no, we are not Muslims. Well, then are you Romans or are you Franks? They said, what do you mean? Everyone knows that if you're not a Muslim, you're either a Roman or a Frank. They said, Caliph, no, that's not true. We are from Armenia. Our land is called Armenia. We are called Armenians. They again began to talk about what it was like in Armenia, and he stopped them. And he said, why won't you answer my question? They said, Caliph, what question have we not answered? Are you Franks or are you Romans? They again laughed and they said, Caliph, we are Armenians. We come from Armenia. They call us Armenians. And again, he stopped them. Then he said, do you know the difference between an Armani and an Isfahani? They said, no, Abdul-Malik, we do not know the difference between an Armani and an Isfahani. And Abdul-Malik looked at them and said, well, if you do not know the difference between my people, why should I know the difference between yours? And so from that day on, we come down to the fact that, as everyone knows, if you're a non-believer, you must be either a Frank or a Roman. By the way, it's Abdul-Malik who also tells us how to tell the difference. It's a very famous saying of Abdul-Malik. Abdul-Malik says, if you stare into a man's eyes, and he is an unbeliever, and you see no light of intelligence shining back, then you are speaking with a friend. Well, as always, the great Abdul-Malik wound up meeting the sunder of societies, the destroyers of delights. And when he passed, did not his son inherit? Al-Walid the First. And Al-Walid the First is famed for extending al-Islam as far as we know. In fact, the story is told of Al-Walid riding his horse into the great ocean in the west, getting off his horse in the ocean, kneeling on his knees and crying. And his companions all came to him and said, Al-Walid, why are you crying? And Al-Walid turned to them, his knees still in the ocean, and said, for there is no place else for me to spread al-Islam. I am stopped by the ocean. And so it is said that that is as far west as al-Islam is allowed to go, as far as the Caliph Al-Walid made. And of course, in his time, Muslims went into Al-Andalus and deep into Persia, and extended as far as al-Islam extended. But as a caliph, as a caliph of the Umayyads, he of course told everyone that, well, after I am caliph, my son must be caliph after me. And so it was commanded, and so it was done. And his son, you can see him here, his son started the second half of the Umayyads. We separate the two because these Umayyads are different. It is said that Ibn al-Malik and Marwan all were humble men who knew their origins, who knew they were just followers of the Prophet. But these Umayyads saw themselves as princes. The very first one was Sulayman. Sulayman was the very first one to adopt the title Prince of the Muslims. There were always those, Marwan himself, who called himself Caliph of the Muslims. But no one had ever used the name Prince until Sulayman. Sulayman said he was Caliph of the Muslims and Prince to the Muslims. It was Sulayman, in his wisdom, who decided to attack and was the first Muslim to attack Constantinople. But as false humility would show, he was unable to capture the great city. Sulayman, despite claiming he was a prince of the Muslims, fell back. The Romans stayed in Constantinople. They not rule it after Sulayman left the earth. But Sulayman, being a Umayyad, declared that after he died, would not others inherit, not his son per se, but a grandson of Marwan the First. That everyone agreed that after Sulayman, the next prince of the Muslims would be UMAR the Second. And UMAR, a grandson of Marwan, UMAR was caliph. Was not caliph for a particularly long time, only for about 3 years. But again, he was there certainly long enough to force everyone to agree that after he passed, the caliph of the Muslims would go to another son of Abdul-Malik. Well, the sad truth is that the son he made everyone agree to become caliph was unfortunately another Yazid. This was Yazid the Second, certainly not as despicable as Yazid the First. But let me remind the ladies in the class, do not name your children Yazid. Yazid was the second was considered to be a fat man, a lazy man whose only interest was in food. Consequently, of course, not a very good caliph. Surprise, surprise. And he again forced everyone to agree that another one of his brothers would be made caliph in the event of his death. Unfortunately, Yazid II's reign was short, to be replaced by HISHAM, another one of the brothers. HISHAM was by far wiser than Yazid, although that would not be difficult. HISHAM was considered to be, as with the rest of the family, fairly ugly. Not a sight to lay eyes on was HISHAM. So much so that the story goes around that HISHAM was inspecting his cavalry troops. And there, when he came across the troops, one of the horses raised his front legs and screamed at the sight of HISHAM. And the Caliph looked at the man riding the horse and said, "Why would you pick such a horse to ride into battle who is fighting the people?" The man riding the horse said, "Well, my Caliph, I'm sorry, Prince of the Muslims, but it's not that he's afraid of men. It's just that you are so ugly. You remind him of the veterinarian who he doesn't like." And to this, HISHAM laughed. HISHAM at least had a good sense of humor about it. He laughed about the story and did not have the man's head separated from his shoulders. But to this day, what everyone remembers about HISHAM was that he was not much to look at. He made everyone agree that when he passed, his predecessor's son would become caliph. And when HISHAM passed, did not a son of Yazid II named Al-WALID II, did not he become caliph? Another famed warrior. And he fought in many battles in his youth, but was caliph for a brief period of time before his son would become caliph. And he insisted, of course, that it was his son who should become caliph. No more voting anymore. Now, amongst the Umayyads, it was the sons or brothers, cousins, and so forth of others who would reign after they would reign. After all, they were Prince of the Muslims. Well, sad but true, but the name of Al-Walid's son is, yes, you guessed it, Yazid. Yazid III. Yazid III, not as despicable as Yazid I, not as gluttony as Yazid II, but certainly way more foolish than both of them put together. Now, I have to tell you that the one person of wisdom amongst all the Umayyads was Yazid's wife. Yazid's wife was a faithful woman, a woman of unvarying wisdom, and a woman who must be respected for her sacrifice and her devotion. It is said that Yazid, not being very smart, had bought an Egyptian slave woman when he was younger, called Hababa. But even his relatives thought this was an extravagance, that he should not own such a woman, that it was not good for a man who was going to be caliph to own a woman of this type. So they forced him to sell the woman. He was not very happy about that. In fact, everyone agreed that Yazid was pretty grumpy, and remained grumpy right through becoming caliph. So much so that his wife spoke to him when he became caliph and said, "So now, my master, are you pleased now that you are caliph of the Muslims?" And Yazid, not being very wise, said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "Why are you displeased? You are prince of the Muslims." And Yazid, that faithless man, turned to him and said, "I still want Hababa." And at that, his wife opened a curtain. There was the slave woman Hababa. And she very calmly, very politely left the room. There is a woman with character. If there was ever a opposite of Yazid III, it was be his wife. Fortunately, once again, Yazid III's reign, not particularly long. It's a good thing. And after him followed Ibrahim. Ibrahim is sometimes called the Caliph of a single moon. There are those who say Ibrahim was Caliph but for 3 days, but even in the wildest stories, Ibrahim was never Caliph for more than a single moon, never more than a month. And things were beginning to fall apart under Ibrahim. Rebellions were beginning to rise. People agreeing that and disagreeing. Yazid's were so disliked. No one ever wanted to be ruled by Yazid again. So they rose in the rebellion. Ibrahim's reign, as we know, was very short. He was succeeded again, finally, by Marwan. Marwan II, nice name. Certainly not even Yazid. But by now, the Yazids had done so much damage that it was impossible for the Umayyads to remain in control. The rebellions were too strong. And out of the east, did not the true masters of al-Islam leave the desert and head for Damascus? Now, in all this time, the Umayyads had a flag. In any city ruled by the Umayyads, one could know a Umayyad emir was in charge because from the walls would fly the white flag of the Umayyads. And it is said that in the last battle of Marwan, Marwan left Damascus, and when he left it, it was all flying white flags. And he took his army and he fought the invasion of the Abbasids. There, everyone could tell the Abbasids because the Abbasids flew black flags. The flags of the white Umayyads and the black Abbasids fought a battle. And Marwan was defeated. And he and his survivors rode back to Damascus to raise another army. But when they arrived at Damascus, the flags flying from the walls were not white. They were black. And Marwan was forced to flee. And he and his sons fled. He fled across the desert. In fact, his sons had to swim across the Nile. And everyone said, that was chasing them, said, no, you cannot swim the Nile. You'll drown. Come back. We promise to let you live. Just come back. We don't want to see you drown. And most of Marwan II's sons turned back. And when they came back on the shore of the Nile, did not the rebels cut off their heads at once? For they had lied. They had no intention of allowing any of the sons of Marwan II to live. And only one survived. He crossed the Nile, crossed all the way across Africa. And to this day, the last of the Umayyad rulers rules in Al-Andalus, where the white flag still flies over Cordoba today, because that's the last holdout in the far, far west of the Umayyads of Marwan II. But who is to succeed them? That was the great question. The Abbasids had raised a revolt from the west, and the Abbasids came forward, and they took Damascus. They decided it would be they who would rule now. And al-Islam, and to this day, do not the Abbasids rule? But not in Damascus. As what happens with the righteous Caliphs, they did not stay in Damascus very long. The first of the Caliphs took the name Al-Safa. They had other names. In fact, the rule of the Abbasids was based on the fact that when you became Caliph, you didn't use a name like Yazid, thank the gods, but you took a new name. And the first of the Abbasids to rule was a man called Al-Safa, although most people don't call him Al-Safa. Al-Safa was famous for being, well, let us say, not very forgiving as a caliph. He is famous for saying he must issue rough justice. Why? Well, but a few days before, everyone saw us as rebels and as common men. Now they must see us as caliphs. And to this day, most mothers would tell their children about Al-Safa, but using his nickname, Al-Sibta, the shedder of blood. Al-Sibta is often uses a warning for children who will not clean up their room. The mother will say to her child, you better go and clean up your room or Al-Sibta will come and get you, the shedder of blood. It's a very famous story about this. It's a story from the great court poet Abu Nuwas. Abu Nuwas was brought before the Caliph, accused of corrupting the morals of youth. And the Caliph gave him a choice. He might go to Mecca on the pilgrimage on the Hajj, or he might go to jail. Well, of course, the great court poet immediately agreed to go on the Hajj, to travel to Mecca. Well, the Caliph, being a wise man, assigned 2 men to go with him. One, a mullah, a learned man in al-Islam, to remind him why you go to Mecca, why you're there for the Hajj. The other one he sent was a lawyer to get him out of trouble. Well, I can tell you now, mullahs and lawyers and court poets are not very good at planning trips. Halfway there, were the 3 of them down to but 1 bowl of rice. They argued, they remonstrated. Who would eat the last bowl of rice? Well, they couldn't agree. And finally, the great court poet Abu Nuwas said, let us all sleep on it. And in our sleep, surely Allah will come before us and tell us who should eat the last bowl of rice. And to this they agreed. And in the morning, did not the lawyer wake up and said, I've had the most wondrous of dreams. In my sleep, did not lovely women come down, gather me up, bring me to heaven, and sit me at the right hand of Allah himself? Surely, this is a sign that I should eat the rice. The mullah said, no, not so fast. I too was met in my sleep by lovely maidens. And there they carried me off into the heaven. And there I was seated at the right side of the Prophet himself, peace and blessings be upon him. And surely this is a sign that I should eat the rice. Well, they could not agree. And all this time, uncharacteristically, the court poet had said nothing. They both turned to him very suspiciously. They said, Abu Nuwas, did you not have a dream? He said, oh, yes, I had a dream. Well, tell us of your dream so we can decide. Well, it's not very exciting, he said. There were no women. There was no heaven. I did not see the Prophet or or Allah. Well, what did you see? Well, the court poet said, I'll tell you. There was a great cloud of mist. And when the mist parted, there was Al-Sibta, the shedder of blood. And Al-Sibta looked at me, and with one bony finger, he pointed at my nose and he said, you, eat the rice. And so I did. So now you know. Every time a mother wants their children to clean the room, why they threaten them with Al-Sibta. After Al-Sibta, of course, there's the more famed Al-Mansur. And Al-Mansur, not wanting to live in Damascus, traveled farther to the east. There he built a new city called the Round City of Mansur. And it was designed with a great mosque in the center and government buildings around the outside. And there, safely ensconced in the east, with the Abbasids rule al-Islam. And Al-Mansur took out all of his people and they began building the city. That was his plan. And of course, as all plans, there is always a flaw in the plan. We don't call the round city anymore. No, the round city took the name of a village that was just down the river. We now call the round city Not what Al-Mansur wanted it to be called, but after that tiny little village down the river. The round city, as everyone knows, is now called Baghdad. Well, Al-Mansur lived in Baghdad and had it built for many, many years, to be succeeded by his son, Al-Makti. And Al-Makti was famed as a warrior, and at this time, around the round city, other sectors and quarters began to pop up, different places. In fact, it was Al-Makti who stopped living inside the round city at all. He moved out and had a palace on the Tigris River, and he moved out and had a palace there. That's one of the famed early palaces of the Abbasids, called the Khalidi Palace. Well, Al-Makti went on, and Al-Makti was succeeded by his son, Al-Hadi. Al-Hadi also lived in a palace, but Al-Hadi has always been the example of a man who would, let's say, be careful with the coin. You remember way back amongst the righteous caliphs that Uthman's failing was he didn't know what to do with money. Al-Hadi's problem is he didn't know what to do to spend money. So much so there was a famous tale of his son. His son once said that he would give a great prize to anyone who could tell a lie that he couldn't believe. Well, everyone jumped up to get this prize. They told lie after lie after lie, and each time they told a lie, the Caliph would say, that story I believe. No one could seem to tell the Caliph a story he wouldn't believe. And once again, everyone noticed that the great court poet Abu Nuwas was being uncharacteristically silent. They looked at him and they said, Abu Nuwas, do you not want the prize? And he said, oh yes, I'd like the prize. But you're not going to tell me a lie I cannot believe? Well, as it turns out, I've already had a vision by which it's been told to me who should get the prize. The Caliph looked at him suspiciously and said, oh, and who told you who should get the prize? Well, I was drifting off during some of the long stories, and I was falling asleep. And who should come out of the mist but your father, the Caliph Al-Hadi. And Al-Hadi looked at me and he whispered in my ear and he said, tell my son to give you the prize. And then I woke up. The Caliph looked at him and said, now there is a story I do not believe. And that is the famous story of how Al-Hadi was a little close with money, if you will, not willing to give it away. And when it was told that to the Caliph that his father agreed to give someone money, well, that was the lie that could not be believed. And who was his son? Probably the most famous of all the Caliphs. The man whose name is written down in story and told even outside of Al-Islam. That man is Harun al-Rashid, one of the chief characters of the 1,000 Nights and a Night. There are storytellers everywhere who tell the famed stories of Harun al-Rashid. It is often said that those who are the greatest among us are those whose stories we have heard about. Now, I will not tell you all the stories of Harun al-Rashid, because certainly one can read about them in 1,000 Nights and a Night. Although it is said that Harun's wisdom was not Harun himself, but in his wife, Zubaydah. She was considered to be one of the wisest women in all of Al-Islam. And whenever there was a question of wisdom, one side or the other, it was always Harun who would go to Zubaydah and again ask Zubaydah what would be the truth of it, and she would always answer. So even though many people say that Harun's reign was filled with mistakes, and many people will begin by telling stories of Harun by saying, and now a story of Harun al-Rashid, may Allah be pleased with him, may he forgive Harun his many mistakes, and there were many. Everyone forgives Harun because of Zubaydah. For if it had not been Harun, surely there would not have been Zubaydah. Now Harun had two sons. As often happened with great men, when you have two sons, who gets the prize? Who becomes Caliph? And Harun made his two sons go to Mecca and sign a document swearing that his first son would inherit first and the other son would support him. And after he passed, then his brother would become Caliph, and not before. And they signed this document, swore before Allah in the Kaaba itself. And then they went back to Baghdad. And when Harun passed, as in the document, his first son, Al-Amin, became Caliph. You can still see remains of things that Al-Amin built. The gate of Al-Amin in Baghdad still exists to this very day. And you can go and visit that gate, added to the city by Al-Amin himself. Al-Amin was certainly not a very pious man. He was a lover of art, of architecture. He loved to build things. He loved to hear poetry. He loved to give money to poets. But those kinds of people, of course, aren't always the best administrators. And so it was that his brother grew tired of his reign, went to Mecca, went to the Kaaba itself and tore up the document and raised a rebellion, laid siege to Baghdad, and took his brother's place by separating his head from his shoulders. And so it was we have Al-Mamun, who becomes Caliph in his place. One of the great warrior Caliphs. Certainly he took it by force, despite having agreed always to support his brother, and his brother is killed. This one, much more pious, much more wise than was Amin, and he reigned for a long number of years, although he was not very good with artists. After him was another one of the sons of Harun al-Rashid, the youngest, Al-Mutasim. The name of Al-Mutasim is often mentioned in harsh whispers, for it is said that Al-Mutasim made a great mistake we all live with today. It is Al-Mutasim who allowed the Turks to come to Baghdad. Well, no one's perfect. After Al-Mutasim, though, we have another, not one of Harun's sons, but one of Al-Mutasim's sons, Al-Malik. Al-Malik was a very pious man, built more walls. Al-Malik was a bit of a combination of his grandfathers, Mamun and Amin. He knew about poetry, he knew about the arts, he knew about architecture, but he also knew how to be a warrior. His only mistake, still forgot to throw out the Turks. Well, what are you going to do? After Al-Malik, we have the famed Al-Mutakawil. Al-Mutakawil is the grandson of Harun al-Rashid. In fact, in his old age, it said that Harun doted on the boy, made a terrible mistake. The boy once came to Harun and said, I do not wish to learn. I do not wish to learn how to read. I prefer to ride horses. And in his old age, Harun, in one of his many mistakes, agreed the boy did not have to learn to read. Well, and so it was that it is still said to this day that Al-Mutakawil was the first of the Caliphs to reign as Prince of the Muslims and not be able to read. Normally, this is a problem amongst the Franks. Well, his reign was not particularly long, although certainly longer than we would have liked. And today, Today, of course, he is replaced by the great and wonderful Al-Mutasir. And now you know the story of how Al-Mutasir became Caliph of Muslims, prince of us all, and the man who now rules in the name of the Caliph, in the name of the Prophet, in the name of the house of the Abbasids, and is our rightful and true ruler of all of Al-Islam. And so it shall be, and so it is, until he himself meets the sunder of societies and the destroyer of delights. Well, thanks very much if you've sat through this whole thing. I want to thank you all and award you all for your bravery for sitting through such a long story. But that's my interpretation of how a Far Easterner might have looked on all of the people who succeeded the Prophet, all the Caliphs of Al-Islam, from the beginning until his day, at least anyway. I hope you enjoyed it as the story was. Please don't take any offense about any of these things. Remember, these are just stories. These are the kind of things that the common people would tell about their rulers, as often common people do, where they'll have their biases and their prejudices, and they'll say one thing about a caliph, and it might be scurrilous and might not be, but it certainly tells you how they felt about that party or that part of the rulership of the land that they were living in. So once again, thank you very much, and I'll leave you with this final thought. Don't name your children Yazid. Thank you.